The other purpose is then to encourage each of you. Some of you have over the years, someone like Henry has done this numerous times, has offered guest Divrei Torah teachings. So we want to encourage you others to do that. I mean, also, so is Deborah. Deborah's done it many times too. So the goal here is to invite others to. I think Jenny's done it as well. Anyway, the point is that the point here is that the point of this class is to inspire you. So I hope that when you take this, you'll say to yourself, hey, we would like to offer, or I would consider it. And it's not hubris or, arrogance. This is the goal. The goal of a strong, vibrant shul is to have the members do some of the roles and learn how to do these things. First of all, when me and Jenny might be out of town for a Shabbat. But even in general, is that the goal we would like to increase is opportunities over the course of the year for various reasons for congregants to offer their own Torah teachings. And we recognize that people are busy and have a lot of, so it may take some time. And we're here, absolutely, me and Jenny, to help. If there's a way we can guide you, of course, we're here. And we have active people like yourselves. Many people listening to this class already could help as well. But the goal here really is to give you some of the tips from me, some from Jenny, and to share from each other what we do. Okay, and then see what it would be helpful in the end. But with the goal to hopefully somebody signs up over time. Okay. Any questions before we get started? All right, cool. So let's jump in. I want to start before I share with you my shtick. From people here who have offered Divrei Torah before, can you share with us? Who'd be willing to share with us a little bit of their, maybe a short summary of kind of what do you do when you create a Divrei Torah? What is your system if you have one? How would you describe it briefly? And then I'll go into mine a little bit. Who'd like to share? I'm looking at Deborah and Henry here and Janice. All right, Deborah, tell me what do you do when you do make the Divrei Torah?
The first thing I do is read the parsha. I think that's really important. And I read the whole thing. We only do triennial, only is not the right word. We do triennial, so we only do part of it, but I read the whole thing because sometimes, as the rabbis do, there's something in a part that we didn't read that really grabs me and not the part that we are reading. And then I usually search other Torah commentaries. So I generally go to JTS, which always has Torah commentary, and they have an archive. So if what the person this year said doesn't float my boat, which is often the case, I can go back and I can look at other.
You said JPS, Jewish Publications Society.
No, JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary.
Yes, okay. So you look there on the JTS.
So I go there because that's the conservative movement. And also I often go to the American Jewish University in California because they also are the conservative seminary. The Reform movement also has a website with Torah commentary every week. And oftentimes that's really interesting. And because mine is often a social action perspective, that's often their focus as well. So I sometimes find things that are interesting from there. I got to say that oftentimes I read all that and I go, okay, none of that speaks to me at all. I don't know what the heck these people are going on about. And then I really have to think about what it is in the parsha that speaks to me. And then I write about that. And when I first started doing it, I wanted to make sure that, I guess because it was a sort of support for me, I tried to have some kind of reference to other parshiot, or other Divrei Torah, or other commentators, especially, like older commentators, although I rarely agreed with them. I like to reference them. As I've gone on more and more, I've stopped doing that. I sort of thought, as I always tell my students, we have a long history of lay people commentating on Torah, and there's no reason why I can't be there on that line, is what I tell them. There's a reason I can't be part of that line as well. My Torah, the only thing about my Divrei Torah I think that is different than what most other people do is I don't ask for comments. I'm a teacher and I get comments all the time and I'm constantly being interrupted. So my opportunity to speak for like 5 minutes without anybody interrupting me is really golden, and I grab that, which is not to say that the, question and answer isn't useful. It just isn't useful for me. It's not my style. So that's what I do.
Yeah, it's awesome. Okay, Deborah, I'm wondering actually in the chat, just to be sure on the same page, I think some people are familiar. If you could put some of the links to those sites that you recommended. This is,
Sure.
I'm going to share some also today. Somebody I think will know. but you mentioned the JTS.
Yeah. Okay, let me see if I can find them.
Yeah, cool. I mean, just put in the chat, just so, and people feel free like to take notes, and these are ideas to suggest. So Deborah's suggesting, but I think it's very powerful. She looks at the parsha and says, what is it that touches my heart? And we're going to get back. That's a beautiful idea. All right, Henry, I'm calling on you. What do you do when you make a Dvar Torah?
Okay, I start the same way that Deborah does. I read the entire parsha, and then one of my main sources for deepening the understanding is actually the commentary in the Chumash. And what people don't always dig into is you got the commentary verse by verse at the bottom of each page, but you also have intros before the book, and at the end you have more discussion, and I tend to go to those. And part of the reason
in the Eitz Chaim itself, you like the Eitz Chaim particular commentary.
I like Eitz Chaim, and I like the previous version of it. And part of the reason I dig in there is I'm particularly interested in language. Yeah. I'm interested in how things are phrased, what words are used, and I want to relate them to us today, because the meaning of words change, the meaning of language change, and it's hard to take that. So I look at it not with a particular perspective. Deborah talks about social action. I look at it with respect to anything in my life that might be reflected in the way things happened. And I just love the changes. And I'll just take 30 seconds. One of the things that I've talked about, I've lectured about at other universities is everyone knows the verse, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, says the preacher. That's King James Version translation. Yeah. What does vanity have to do with walking in the footsteps of one's Lord? And the problem is not that it was a bad translation, it's that English has changed. Exactly. Hevel v'hevelim. It foreshadowed the life of Abel, brief life. And so it says you should not base your life on things that change quickly, that are transient. You should look for some things that are worthwhile. And so that to me is an example of talking about how we should live our life today. And by the way, I find Kohelet to be, to me, the most interesting book in the Tanakh.
Let's not go too much, right? You're already getting Dvar Torah. No, but it's excellent though. It's excellent. All right. So I want to just say that. So Henry's really making. So Deborah gave a kind of we'll call more contemporary, website. But by the way, all these are great. And Henry giving more, might call it old school, like the actual Chumash that we have in shul. That's the whole point of it. Is it has, and ours are really impressive commentary. Like it's academic, it's biblical, but it's also meaningful. It's values based. There's a lot of. And then there's language. Henry's a big language. I know that also Diane's into that. I mean, obviously I'm into that too. I like that too. So already seeing different perspectives, but I think it's interesting. Both of you all, like you just look at the parsha first, you're going to read through and say, what hits my heart is a powerful way to start it. But you have maybe different commentaries you tend to look out for next. I also want to point out that Deborah makes a great point. It is generally speaking, it's become Beth Meyer custom over all these years that I do like a discussion. I mean, that's how Jenny and I tend to do it. But not always. And the expectation for those of you that would, I hope, sign up to do some guest Dvar Torah doesn't have to be discussion, as Deborah noted. It can be a more traditional Dvar Torah, meaning like you give your opinion. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a back and forth. I know sometimes Henry's done that I think both of those examples. So whatever, you can feel free to, Dvar Torah here. We're gonna, I think, focus more on the more traditional, what you speak for. It doesn't have to be necessarily a teaching session, but both are, of course, appropriate when you all please sign up at some point. All right. Who else has done it? I think Janice has done it too. Janice, want to say a few words? Yeah, Janice, what's your policy or practice?
So most of the Dvar Torahs that I give are at a committee meeting.
Yeah.
So I start out thinking, it's almost setting like a kavanah, an idea of part of the message that I want to bring, because I know the agenda of the meeting. So I sort of know I know what we're going to be talking about, and then I do a little bit of a seesaw approach, because then I do read the whole parsha like everybody else, and then I sort of reconsider, is this appropriate? Is this going to fit in? and depending on how strong I feel about the meaning I want to convey, I sometimes will go beyond the parsha, and I'll talk about a holiday that's coming up, or another current event that's coming up. And but it's definitely a seesaw. It's a balance. I sort of go back and forth.
So seesaw between the topic.
But seesaw is between what I want to accomplish at the meeting, like the what and the how, and the what and the how. And since most of my devars are to a committee, I actually encourage participation, because I'm starting this meeting and I want people to pay attention to the meeting and make sure we're sort of all on sort of the same page and motivated. And I think it brings a lot of energy to begin the meeting with the Devar Torah.
Awesome, Janice. I've seen and experienced many of your wonderful
really cool.
fish. Go ahead. So I think a couple things good Janice brought in, I think are really cool to put on the table. First of all, it's not just based on the Parsha, which the Torah Parsha week, obviously that's very appropriate, but also could be a holiday. It could be a theme or a value, or based on what you're engaging in. So if it is obviously Shabbat is very, but there may be other things happening in the world. They say, well, I want to address this. And I've done that too, right? You've seen that, where I take a different, something else from rabbinic literature, something completely Talmudic. It doesn't have to be the Torah portion. I think it's also good to be aware of that. You don't have to do it on the Torah portion. Beautiful. And then also it's at committee meetings as well. Yeah, it's like you're balancing what the goal is versus what the interesting Torah teaching is. And
one great example that I'd like to give is Thanksgiving.
Yes.
When I have a meeting around Thanksgiving, it usually is the Devar is usually going to be somehow related to Thanksgiving, even though it's secular.
Right. Beautiful. That's awesome, Janice. Relevance is really critical. All right. Now I'm assuming I really didn't go around to usual thing where I say, like, why are you taking this class? I assume everyone's here to kind of learn how to do a stronger Devar Torah, or maybe do it first. But we're just trying to gather some ideas. Is there anyone else that's done this before, or has any, or even if they haven't done before, but has like some general thoughts about this they want to put out there, or any questions off the top of that before I give you my spiel, which is going to integrate some of this stuff? Any other kind of, I think Linda, have you done it before? Yeah, Rick, what do you say, Rick?
Just like to share what's running through my head, coming somewhat from Deborah and Henry, that what they search for in preparation is what has meaning to their heart, or in Deborah's case, and that would be mine too, what is relevant to social justice. But there's a third thing that I'm curious about, and whether anybody has done it or whether it's a no-no. When I read a Pasha, there's two, broadly speaking, categories of things that come to me. And one of them is what we're talking about, things that have meaning and they're inspiring. And the other thing, and this runs through my journey with Judaism, things that I find really, really disturbing. I don't particularly want to know about which tribes in the Exodus were allowed to be run over and killed and which weren't, and the number of people who are not allowed to love the people who they choose. And there's just a lot of disturbing things in there. And I don't know, you want to inspire people and make them happy, but I struggle with things in the Torah that do not attract me to. It's a history, and I can appreciate the history, but nonetheless, we adore the Torah and we celebrate it, and yet some of its content I find offensive. And do we ever grapple with that in the Devar Torah? Is it something that is a no-no because people, it's like a scary movie or a sad movie, you don't want to leave unhappy? But why not in a Devar explore what's not the beautiful picture, and how do we reconcile that with our love of Torah and our love of religion and attachment? So that's kind of what I've struggled with for a long time. And if I was to give a Devar, then it'd be a part of me would want to go into that and say, well, what's up with this?
Rick, I'm so grateful for you. I think this is a great question to hear what you all think. I thought about this too, but so what do you do with the hard parts of the Torah? Linda, what do you say?
I just tried doing this once when you guys were away, and I didn't know what I was doing. So, this is going to be helpful for me, but I did approach it with, there were things in there. It was about Kohanim and all their stuff, and I didn't know very much about it myself. And I wanted to sort of teach the congregation along with me things that, you may not have known about Kohanim, and then, go into some of the you know, issues and struggles with some of the topics involved with them, but I approached it also as educational for the congregation and myself too.
Wonderful. Linda. Yeah,
Yeah,
but it wasn't good, so I need to
No,
learn
it was
to do
fine.
it better.
It was fine, Linda. It was fine. It really was. You did great.
How about yourself, Linda?
yeah. Rick, I would say go for it, because that immediately engages people and goes, ooh, I may feel a little uncomfortable, but this is amazing that as Jews, we can, you know, we can fight with the Torah, basically.
Yes.
I mean, I think what I was going to say is, I think that one of the things, and again, this is something I tell my students all the time, one of the things that makes Judaism, I think, unique in world religions is that although we honor our traditions, we're constantly grappling with them. And that the grappling with them, that we are Yisrael, we are God wrestlers, that the grappling with them is actually what makes us who we are. And so if you are grappling with something which is in a Torah portion, then I think that it's more than appropriate. I think that it's wonderful I think it's part of the job of the person who's giving the Divar to actually bring that forth and talk about that. And if you're comfortable engaging in conversation with that, I mean, Eric and Jenny do that all the time. And I think that that's again, I think that's what makes us who we are. We honor every word in the Torah, but we don't necessarily say that just because it's written there, A, we have to agree with it, and B, we can't struggle with it. And so I think that's really important, and I think you should do that.
Oh, yeah. Any other thoughts about this before we?
Yeah, just, you know, I've done a few longer ago than more recently when I was sisterhood president, and I had a message. My whole thing was Gemilut Hasadim, acts of loving kindness. So I would always gear it towards that and try to leave people with something. I mean, one year I remember during Sisterhood Shabbat, challenging people to do, everybody does them, but challenging people to do more. And I had what I called little pocket-sized ideas, and had little pieces of paper, they were index cards, I say, on the tables of all the, you know, in the social hall, so people could pick up and bring with them. So something to take with them. I think a lot of people love the ideas as we talk about them, and then forget what actually happened. God, that was a really good Devar, but I really can't remember exactly what it is. And I'm more of the concrete person. So it's wonderful no matter what you do, if you can give someone something to take away.
You fit. Something practical they can walk away with, be inspired by. You fit. That is, I think, a dream home run. All right. I'm just gonna say, I have nothing really substantively to say here, just to your wonderful question, Rick, to say that I think that this is just a beautiful, I love the fact that you or others or myself even would struggle with the entirety of the Torah, not even the one that's hard, you know, done lovingly and respectfully. I think it's totally kosher and actually a great statement about our willingness to kind of wrestle. And I think it's great. But, you know, your point is well taken. Even I myself, like, I tend to avoid certain things that attract me and don't attract me. That's the power of it. But I think, Rick, if some part, like there's a passage on Sota, the woman who's accused of adultery, this whole very painful, and I didn't have thought about before, and I've said before, I said, hey, heads up, this is not my top 10 favorite things about the Torah, but I feel like we gotta get in there and deal with this question. I think there is a place for that. So if you feel motivated and fired up, you know, sei gesund. But I think it's good you're raising, there's a tension there. It's challenging. We do.
To me, it also raises the question of how the religion adapts and evolves over the years. There's things we reject, and even if they're in the Torah, do we have the freedom to say, no, we don't do that anymore? And that, I'm happy that that's, I mean, I know it's not forbidden and that our discourse is part of our heritage and our gift, but anyway, I wanted to throw that out. Thank you.
Great point. And that should be something we should all talk about when we think about our own Devar Torah. We don't have to avoid the hard parts, like you said. We can go in there on some of the ones that are challenging for us. That's awesome. All right. So I'm going to start by just offering, I have a hope, I'm going to share my screen in a second. But before, I was going to tell you a story. This really relates. I'm going to jump right in to one of my first stories I had prepared. So Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, this is not Harold Kushner. Harold Kushner is the one when bad things happen to good people. That's amazing teaching itself. Lawrence Kushner is also a Boston area rabbi who's retired, more of a mystic, and he wrote a number of books. One of the stories I love, and I'm looking at Deborah because I think she might know this from, it involves a preschool. It's a great story. He had all the preschool kids come to his shul. His shul's in Sudbury, Massachusetts. You know, it's outside of Boston. And he tells the story. They came in the shul, and he was going to show them the ark where the Torah is, the Aron. And of course, that's the Torah, but it's the preschool kids. So he says to the kids, hey, what do you think's in the ark? And it's a little dated, this story. It's probably 30. So one kid who's like a goofy kid says, I think there's a brand new car. But like out of The Price is Right or something. But I don't even, he tells it like this, almost they're not kidding. Like this is like, because they don't know what's behind a curtain. They think that's what it is. Another kid says, it's the Torah. Another kid says, nothing. I think nothing's there. And one kid says, I think there's a mirror. And each of those answers is amazing. But I'm just going to focus on the word mirror because he goes off on this as a board. He says basically, the truth is he tells the child that says it's a mirror that is the most, in his view, and I think he's right, profound answer. That it's not actually that the Torah is in the ark, it's that a mirror is in the ark. Because whenever we read the Torah, and I'm using this writ large, whether it's the Talmud or the Torah portion of the week or a holiday, essentially it is a mirror because what we see in the Torah is based on our soul print, right? What we find what's interesting to Deborah and to Henry and to Rick is not necessarily gonna be interesting to me. Like what's gonna touch me, really, it's a mirror. Like when I read the text, it's really, you know what I'm saying? It's like what I think is cool is because I have certain interest in that part of the text. And what's gonna interest me is not gonna interest someone else. But every time I look at the text, it touches me hopefully in a different way. I'm sure you all, this actually is about any piece of great literature in a way, right? If you read certain books or texts or Shakespeare or whatever, like we're all gonna be touched by certain parts differently because we're all different people. So the first question really I think raised here is that when you're gonna give a Devar Torah, you have to decide what is your subject matter gonna be, and then you're gonna say, well, what touches me? What touches me? Now, the question I think that was also raised here, which is relevant, is that when you give a Devar Torah, if you want to engage your audience, which all of us want to engage on some level, we have to ask the question, is what touches me going to be interested to the congregation? And that is, I think, the ongoing tension of any speech. I don't know, I'm not saying to people that are in business or in teaching, is that what I want to talk about, how am I going to make this interesting to the community at writ large? I think that is a tension we have to constantly struggle in any Devar Torah we're going to give. Because if we give a really interesting point, but we're the only one interested in that, and we don't make it broad enough, then people going to be snoozing. But I think it's powerful to say if it interests me, then probably it interests more than just myself as well. And what are my thoughts about this issue, about finding the tension with what interests me, what interests my listeners, even in general speaking? Did anyone here experience that experience? Think about that tension?
You know, I think that's true, but then I'm thinking sometimes it might be equally as important to give people something that they might not, you know, want to hear or be touched by or something like that, because it's an important thing for them to hear.
Absolutely, Roberta. I would say even when important for me here, just see, are they, I'm just interested, but what makes it?
How do you make it for them? Right. They may not know that they're interested, you know, like you don't know you need it until Steve Jobs told you, right?
Oh, good point. Yeah, Alan, what do you say?
I think it's about the topic, but it's also about the delivery.
Exactly.
Because I've heard really boring topics done by really engaging people,
Yeah.
that you hang on that. So for me, in my own life, it's, you know, I'm on the business side, sometimes I got to talk about really boring things, but I need to engage a lot of people around that really boring thing. So how I approach it and how you communicate and sort of converse and present yourself, I think is a key part.
So out of curiosity, I mean, I don't know if it's maybe too broad, but Alan, would you say, is there a general rule when you have to convey some piece of information, especially if you don't think it's going to be naturally exciting? Do you have like a general approach to how you try to make it more engaging, or is it each one's unique to how you do it? Is there like a broad question you're asking yourself or style?
Yeah, if I know it's dead boring, then I typically start out by saying, this is going to be dead boring, but you have to hang with me because there's going to be something at the end here.
Got it.
And that sort of doesn't sort of set an expectation, but it engages people because now you're saying something almost about yourself in the delivery and the topic that makes it approachable.
So honesty in a sense.
Exactly.
I think the other thing that's useful is in education, we call it scaffolding. So if you can hang something on something that people already know or that they're already connected with, then you can often build on that and go someplace else. So if you're doing a devar in the shul, you could assume that the people who are there on an ordinary Shabbat where there's nothing special happening are people who are engaged in some way in Jewish learning or Jewish practice or something. There's something about being there that engages them. So if you start with talking about a Jewish value or Jewish history or some kind of collective Jewish experience, then you can often hang or push on to new or different kind of ideas because you've already started with something that people are already connected to.
So start with something, yeah. And Robin, you have something? Yeah, Robin?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to kind of break the invisible wall, right? Where you set conditions that let everyone in the room know that we're at the same place. I might be coming to this discussion or coming to this devar with different things in my toolkit. However, this is a journey we're taking together. So I think what we do at the shul, where most of the time we're, passing the microphone around, it's not always delivered from the bima. Sometimes it's delivered from the floor, is a way of doing this in community. And it opens us up to that congregational dialogue that says all of us have something to contribute. I just happen to be the one that's doing some facilitating today. And like Alan mentioned, let me own not the most exciting, stimulating topic, but we're going to get into this together and we're going to come through something with some new knowledge or a different perspective.
You're fair. Beautiful, Robin. Beautiful. All right. So I want to just say that, I think just it's kind of dovetails on what the already been shared, but just kind of put it, as we say, in broad strokes. The two ways that I do this, and I'm offering my experience, is that I either, I'd say generally, is I'm going to, put this way, there are two ways in Jewish tradition that rabbis famously look at a Jew, like when they want to offer a Torah teaching of some kind. And Maimonides is most famous for this, in that Maimonides was generally in his most critical works, like one is called the Guide for the Perplexed, he wasn't necessarily getting very much into the details of the Torah. In fact, Maimonides was asking what we might call big questions. Does God have a physical body? That's like his question. From there, he gets into the Torah and gives his whole analysis. He's asking, is there an afterlife? By the way, this is like Job, how does God deal with good and evil? Why does good and evil exist? Why do righteous people suffer? This is really big questions that one would imagine many people struggle with. These are really fundamental. And then we go into Judaism, try and go into the details of what the Torah portion or whatever we're texting. That's one way. Big question, let's say in light of COVID, how do we deal with long-term suffering? That's a big question. And then now the other way to look at it, and this is more, I think, what Deborah was saying, or Lynn was even saying, or even Henry's point, is you go deep into the detail of one particular interesting little aspect of some little thing, very detailed, something really in the weeds, with the hope that that little weeds thing will later bring you to some kind of bigger question. So you can start from a big question that you're curious about, you want to go in deep, or you start with something detailed and go out large. I mean, both are possible, and there's nothing wrong with each one has their strengths. Like when Jenna said, for example, she goes into a committee, she says, what's this committee meeting about? I see it's almost like this is a big question. Like Thanksgiving is like, how do we be grateful? Or what does gratitude mean? That's like a big question. I think they're both possible. But ultimately, what I want to just say is I think the question we have to be thinking about, and again, I'm sure this is for general public speaking, is to keep our listener engaged, is usually we want to ask some kind of question or raise some idea that sparks interest in your listener. So you want to kind of raise what we say is a koshi, a difficulty, that you're hoping people can be like, yeah, I don't know, what is that about? Even if it could be very specific, like Henry said, the use of the word vanities, or very large, how do we be grateful in a world when there's a lot of suffering? But each one you're trying to see, can I attract people's interest to keep them listening to the process? That's generally what I'm doing. All right, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna share my screen with you all and then go through one of my little list here, and we'll engage in a conversation about see how much you all relate to it, whatever your own thoughts would be. I'm hoping you all can see. Yeah? Okay. Let me stretch this out here. All right. So here's how I framed it here. The first thing I say is a mitzvah. That means mitzvah is Hebrew for finding and Yiddish for if you found gold, it's like, I have a mitzvah. I found something special, okay? How do you find an idea? We just discussed it here already, and you already kind of generated it yourselves as well. What questions do you have, first of all, about the Torah in general? Very large questions. What are some issues we're facing right now as a country? And then, of course, going into the Torah portion of the week, et cetera. Now, the thing I want to bring up here is this line here I have, just so you know a little bit of, again, like rabbinic style historically. There are two ways to look at a text. Let's say we look in the Torah portion. One is called bikiyut and one's called iyun. Bikiyut means to look at it 30,000 feet. Like when I look at a Torah portion about Genesis, what is it saying very broadly? What is the message of this section? And another way to look at it is, as Henry described, iyun, which is like going really, really into the weeds of one particular thing. Both have their attraction. As you probably know me at this now, I like iyun a little more in general. I like iyun. I like to get into some little weed commentary, but both have their value. And sometimes bikiyut, looking broadly, can be really helpful because sometimes we don't necessarily always look at the Torah or a book or a story with its broadest message. Sometimes we get so stuck in the weeds, we lose the idea of the forest. So both are possible. I mentioned here, of course, Torah portion of the week, which is very common, but a holiday, etc. And the last thing I want to say about finding an idea is to remind everyone of the power of story. You all have heard of the book by Yuval Noah Harari, the Sapiens Book. If you haven't, I spoke about it 1 year on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, but he's actually Israeli, and he writes in this book, Sapiens, which is just so phenomenally fascinating, his whole theory about why human beings exist and other creatures did not, or whatever did not, well, how did we survive, is actually his teaching is that we were able to tell stories to one another. That storytelling is kind of fundamental to human existence. And by sharing stories, we could share information across generations to let people survive. Even if those stories aren't true, they could be mythical stories, but they pass on information, allow a group to feel clustered together as one, as he believes I think very convincingly, that is what helped us to survive and flourish. He then argues basically that storytelling is one of the most fundamental pieces of the human soul. And so I want to put out there, and I'm sure you all understand that telling a story, sharing a story, the Torah is filled with stories. It is a very engaging way of bringing people in. Now you have to tell a story well, you have to think it's a story that people will be interested in, it's a lot more, but definitely don't shy away from storytelling. I think storytelling is critical. I know Jenny does as well. And I think some of the greatest speakers in general, like TED Talks, you see, there's always an aspect of a story somewhere in. Okay. For part one, any comments or thoughts about what I just shared? I know it's kind of repeating some things we talked about already. Anybody? All right, tough. All right, let's get into resources. So once you found a question, whether it's broad or whatever, what makes a Devar Torah different than just a regular speech is that you don't generally jump from the Torah or whatever the rabbinic literature may be to what you think. The idea of kind of a classic Devar Torah is you have to give respect and honor to the fact that there are teachers that came before you that have an opinion. And anyone here who's been enough of B'nai Mitzvah at Beth Meyer knows is that, I teach this to all the kids, is that before you offer your opinion, you should go back and give respect and honor to prior opinions of Gone in Jewish history. And I just want to really say that I hope this is where the internet is amazing, but of course, be careful because there's a lot of junk on the internet. So you have to always be careful what you choose. But the ones that Deborah and others have mentioned, the Chumash, these are classics. But I want to just mention here real quickly, something called the Mikraot Gedolot. Mikraot means texts, and Gedol means big ones. The classic big commentaries are Rashi from the Middle Ages, and other what's called Meforshim, which are the very famous commentators. This book, which I do believe exists in the Beth Meyer Library, and it's given off from JPS, Jewish Publication Society, JPS, is an English version, completely translated in English, of the classic. This is like the classic Chumash. So in Shul, we have a Chumash, we have a Torah written in a book form. It has, in English primarily, commentaries around the side. We've had that kind of Torah book forever. But the one we have today has modern Torah commentary, as Henry noted, by modern conservative movement scholars in general. This is the old one, meaning back from hundreds of years ago, the one that was in basically every shul forever, which has the classic commentators. Rashi, Nachmanides are two of the classic ones. There's other ones called Onkelos, which translates this in Aramaic. All of them are Aramaic and Hebrew, but today it's actually in English. So I really want to highly recommend it. First of all, for yourself, this is an awesome book because it has the Hebrew and the English, and has all 5 books of the Torah. So when I go look for a Torah reading, I not only look at the Torah, I look at the commentaries immediately, sometimes in English even. It is so awesome, and they give a lot of interesting ideas to explore. Along those lines, many of you know that the B Mitzvah students, which I put the link here, they use a book called Our Commentary for Our Times, but it's actually somewhat dated at this point, but it's very helpful. It's a Rabbi Fields out of California, may Allah Shalom, rest in peace, who put amazing commentaries together, also in English, that of all the Torah portions that give very specific subjects, and does the same thing, brings the classical commentators together as well as some contemporary. But the most amazing thing today, guys, which did not exist when I was in rabbinical school, which is unbelievable, is called Sefaria. Who knows Sefaria? Raise your hand. Deborah, Linda, okay. So I was thinking actually maybe about opening it up, but if some of you already know it, then I'm not gonna, maybe we won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I definitely think you should click this link. Sefaria is a nonprofit website with has basically all of the rabbinic literature, all the Torah, all the commentaries, the entire Talmud, the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud, all the Midrash, everything up there in Hebrew, and the majority translated in English. You can open up your own account on it, but I'm telling you, like, you don't even have to have this really anymore, although I like having a book form. You can go on Sefaria and just start reading commentaries about the Torah portion. And that's what I just want to put out there and say is, like, if you read the Torah portion, you don't necessarily have something grab you so much. Then what I do is I look at commentaries. What's interesting to Rashi? What's interesting to other classic ones? In the Middle Ages and stuff like that, they often generate ideas for me as well. Not to mention others that are rearranged before. Anyone have any thoughts about Safari? I've used it before and what they've found from it, or any challenges they found from it, or any pointers they want to make from those who've seen Safaria?
I've used Safaria. I find it challenging.
Yeah.
But the best thing about Safaria is that if you go to the Torah portion or whatever the text is, and you click on any phrase, it'll give you a whole list of commentaries on the side. So, if you're reading it and you say, oh, I wonder what this means, or like what Harry was talking about, a particular word or something like that, if you highlight that, right on the side, it'll light up like, here's Rashi, here's Maimonides, here's blah, 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 all that. Not all of it is in translation, which is a little frustrating sometimes, because sometimes the things that I want the most are still not translated, but a lot of it is translated. But my but is that by and large, it's the classic and the old commentators, which I find, for me, they're often less than useful. I mean, it's nice let me rephrase that. Less than useful in what I'm going to say. It's nice to have them. I think we should know them, but as people have noted, they're a little dated, in my opinion, in terms of the way modern people think, particularly for women. So it's nice to know what Rashi has to say, although Rashi never is interested. What's bothering Rashi is never what's bothering me, but and what's bothering me is never bothering Rashi. It's very frustrating. But the sort of caveat for Safari is that most of the commentary is the classic and older commentary. They don't have a lot of the modern stuff, and for me, the modern stuff is much more useful.
Totally.
Safari is fabulous.
I just want to say, like in part one, we're trying to generate a question that we find interesting. Generally speaking, that is like the Jewish way to think of our Torah. Like, do I have a question that I can raise that will be interesting to me, obviously, but also interesting to potentially others? And then and what I'm saying, and Deborah's point one thing is that there are questions raised by the classical commentators, but of course, just like it's a mirror for them, the questions they're asking are not necessarily the questions we're asking. I like it because I'm a traditionalist. I go back and say, well, what was bothering him? Is there something in there? But fair, Deborah's saying, well, then, many times it doesn't. And the truth is that's true. That to me also. I'm like, I don't know if that's so interesting to me. But it might send you on a certain journey to find something over the course of it before we go to more contemporary commentators. Let's say like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs or something. Like, there's a lot of other, potentials as well. Right? Other comments, thoughts about Safaria? All right, I really want, so again, like if you go to you already have access to the Chumash at Beth Meyer, which is our, Eitz Chaim. You can get this JPS commentary, and that's awesome. But Safari, I'm telling you, it's an amazing project, and they're growing all the time with their translations. So Deborah's right; they don't have everything, but they're growing. I'll make sure you definitely know about that. All right, philosophical point. I want to remind everybody when you're going into the Devar, this is something I have to struggle with as well, but it's hard because we, in a postmodern world, we all know we have our biases or our opinions. But one of the goals of, I think, a strong Devar Torah is one where you look at what it says, the Torah or the commentary, not what you want it to say, not what your interpretation is. Of course, it's all translation is interpretation, but you're doing your best to understand in its context what it actually says. And to be clear, you know what it says before you want to talk about what you think it says or what you want it to say, but what does it actually say? People catch the difference between those two things, yeah? Okay, all right, you fit. I want to bring up another point here generally about resources in general, is that conservative Judaism is actually rooted by Zacharias Frankel. Have you ever done the kind of history of where did conservative Judaism come from? One of the terms of our model is called positive historical Judaism. And what does this mean? So some of you know, just very briefly, is that there was traditional Judaism, and then in Germany and in Western Europe, really, there was an establishment of this kind of reforming Judaism. And reform Judaism was the first to kind of push this forward with looking at Judaism in various ways, adjusting to it to a more contemporary times, bringing in academic and biblical study. And some of you know, conservative Judaism was reaction to reform Judaism, that reform, quote unquote, went too far in the changes that they were making. But in retrospect, you look back on the history, the changes were only very slight. They weren't necessarily so different at the beginning. But one of the ideas and leaders of conservatism is Zacharias Frankel. His idea, different, quote unquote, than reform, was positive historical, meaning he would say, when we look at the Jewish tradition or we look at the Torah or commentary, even commentaries, we are comfortable with recognizing there's a historical context to where things came up. So one of the pieces to consider when looking at resources is where and when did that commentator live, and under what circumstances were they commenting on it? And for that matter, the Torah itself. When the Torah has an idea it's presenting, it's okay for us to say, historically, at that time, this is what the situation was. Not to excuse it, not to rationalize it, not to say it's okay, but to recognize that it has a historical context. We're not ashamed of that. We don't have a problem looking at our text as being historical documents. That's kosher in our tradition. And positive, he's said, is to look at it positively, is to look at the Jewish tradition in a way that we're trying to look at it in a positive light, not necessarily in a way that looks interesting and appealing and has something to offer us, as opposed to a negative light where we're constantly trying to remove things. He accused Reform Judaism of basically being negative on Judaism, trying to remove things away. So positive historical. So his history is okay for Devar Torah. All right, next point is machloket. Machloket means debate. One of the things that makes a Devar Torah interesting is when you give multiple opinions. not to mention yours, but others, and you've heard the kids. So I definitely want to encourage you when you give Dvar Torah, but I do as well, is trying to think, what are the various perspectives of different teachers, and can I integrate them as well? And very important Jewish tradition in Hebrew called V'Shem Omro is to say in the name of the teacher who offers the opinion. Again, whether you agree or disagree, whether it's a contemporary teacher, whether it's a student, whether it was a kid in religious school, it's an honor to mention that person's name. And so I always try to do that, try to remember that. Once in a while, it's possible to say, you know what, I heard an idea, but I don't remember who that person was. It's okay, that's very humble, but good to say. I heard a commentary once. It gives a sense of honor to the person who had it. It's like basically giving like, what do you call it? Not royalties, but like respect to the person who came up with the idea. I also want to remind everyone, I think this is really appropriate for our contemporary times, and something that me and Jenny increasingly try to do is to take in consideration diversity of voices, which would mean, Allah Deborah said, not just male European Ashkenazi rabbis from Europe, okay, but like to think about, and obviously there haven't been as many, but more female voices, there's a whole organization called Svara, more queer community voices, voices of people of color, to try to really see, can we bring more voices to the fore, both as rabbis, but also lay people. Again, it is more of a challenge, sadly, because historically, our tradition has been dominated by a certain kind of male model. But that's what it is. That's just the reality. But can we bring in more voices into the future and bring them forward? I invite you to consider that when you're looking at your commentaries. What else is out there today? Obviously contemporary, that can be really meaningful. What are some Mizrahi voices, people from Sephardi backgrounds, people from other traditions, Ethiopian rabbis? What can we go beyond just the classics? Because as much as I just emphasize the classics, if you go there, then you're going to kind of hit into a kind of certain worldview that's limited. Okay, last thing I'll talk about here is biblical scholarship. All right. Who here has done Dvar Torah with biblical scholarship? Who knows what I'm talking about? It's biblical scholarship. Everyone knows what JEPD is? So there's a big debate in our tradition, in our modern tradition. Who wrote the Torah? Was it written by God? How were human beings involved in it? And modern biblical scholarship has been in debates in some religious communities. Can we talk about this? Should we use the Torah and compare it to other ancient Semitic literature from Mesopotamia? And I want to say yes, of course you can. There's nothing wrong with seeing the Torah as being written by human beings or having huge human import. In fact, there's very brilliant teachings that come from great scholars. In fact, someone like Everett Fox, who's taught here at my Reform and others, there's no problem with comparing to other biblical scholarship. Now, as you probably know me well enough, and Jenny for that matter, I don't often go to that stuff. I just don't find it the most rich in terms of just meaning for my I don't love that stuff. That's me, but you can. And in fact, it can be very powerful. There is some cool stuff out there about, ancient stories, like the story of our flood story of Noah and how it compares to ancient Mesopotamian stories from Sumeria. You sometimes can learn some cool stuff about that. Let me just give you one example. I remember medical school hearing an amazing Dvar Torah comparing our Genesis creation story to what's called the Enuma Elish story. Have you ever heard of this fascinating, like Mesopotamian? And the creation story of that Middle Eastern culture is one where there are gods who are fighting with each other and kind of killing each other in the sky, and that's how the world was created through a war. And our Dvar Torah, our Torah is created not through, if you read Genesis, right? It's not based on a war. It's actually based on a lot of division, but it's very peaceful. And the basic Dvar Torah was kind of like the Torah is rooted in a kind of peaceful dynamic and that's based on biblical scholarship. So it's okay to bring it. It was actually interesting, but when you get into it, don't shy away from it. But again, it's not my favorite source of stuff. All right. Let me stop here for a second about resources. Anyone else have any thoughts here before I run through about their resources or how they struggle with biblical scholarship, or have they used it before or seen that kind of stuff? Or you just like listening to me? All right, cool.
So,
all right. Yeah,
Rabbi,
guys.
I noticed a few people in the chat have asked if you could share this document with everybody.
Oh, yeah,
Just
definitely,
for-
definitely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I'm happy to. Yeah, Linda, what's up?
When I was doing mine that one time, beyond these kinds of resources, I mean, Google is very smart. All you need to do is type in either the phrase or the parsha or whatever, and you can get stuff from rabbis all over the country, all over the world, what they used 3 years ago when they did this one. I mean, and all sorts of modern ideas. And you see like Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. I mean, it is overwhelming. I will say that. So that's where I got messed up, is I could not, put my hands on what I should do. But there's a huge world beyond this. So that's what I discovered.
And I say, listen, then I would say in our shul, you can bring a commentary from anywhere. Again, only, as you said, there are some crazy commentaries, and I generally encourage people to keep them within some kind of mainstream structure. But yeah, I mean, feel free to, as you say, if you start Googling around, it can be endless. I tell Science Safari catalogs it easier, but yeah, go for it. Yeah, Deborah, you're saying that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the only thing is that when you do a Google search, even within the mainstream, let's say, of Jewish thought, just be aware of what your source is and what their agenda is, because we all have one, right? And it's not necessarily your agenda, and B, conservative Judaism's agenda, which is not to say that you shouldn't necessarily talk about it, but you should be aware of it. I mean, one of the things I put in the chat was the H.com website, which has a plethora of different commentaries from various different perspectives. But it's important to know that if you're using their commentary, that it's orthodox. And so it has a particular perspective on Torah and where Torah comes from and what the purpose of Torah is and all those kind of things. And you just have to be aware of that if you're going to use that as a source.
Beautiful. So, okay, so the early part is, I looked at Torah, I say, like you all mentioned here, what is interesting to me? What is a big question I'm struggling with? What's a question in the world? Can I get that out of this Torah portion or something out of this that will come in detail or broadly? Then I look at commentaries out there. I like to look at the classics, but there's all kinds of other stuff out there. Safari's got great stuff. You can Google around. Biblical scholarship's okay. And critical, as we mentioned, Bishem Omro. Then when you find something for someone else, you say, to the degree that you're able, here's where I learned this idea from. And the last thing I say is not overdo it, is that I encourage you to give some other commentary to educate the community and show that you struggled with the issue, and Jewish history or Jewish people have struggled with this question, even if it's not your answer, that there's some other ideas out there for people to be curious about the diversity of what's going on out there. But again, not to overdo it, meaning you don't have to give 55 of them. One commentary, two, I usually tell the kids is enough, or something just shows some of the diversity out there of what came before you. It's also a sign of humility, honestly. All right. And then there's part 3 and 4. 3 is bringing it home. So, and it was already mentioned here, relevancy is critical for any speech, whatever it may be, business, education, the Torah. So you want to bring it home. I usually encourage people then to bring some kind of story. That's where the story comes back. Story is so deeply profound. Story leads to curiosity generally. Story, if told well, if it's interesting, it has a climax, a question. And there's no question, offering a personal story is powerful. Of course, be careful, not every story that you share personally is interesting. You have to make sure it's really a story that's worth telling. I remember when I was in rabbinical school, they said, just because it's your story that you find interesting, Eric, doesn't mean that everyone finds it interesting. That happened. You have to really think. So a personal story or a story in general that somehow brings this idea home. The question I asked the Torah portion of the week was, we just had the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. I want to get into detail about what's the Torah, what does that mean? Whatever, I don't know. What did Moses do? Why did we have a golden calf? Why do we have sacrifice? So, but I want to bring it home. What does this mean for us? How can we make it as relevant as possible? And I tell people, of course, they say same thing, typical sermon. Tell them what you're going to say. Tell them what you're going to do it, and then go back and review. Here's what I did. Right. You want to go back and say, here's what I said. And ultimately, a great Devar Torah, it means that a congregant, especially one who's paying attention, should be able to summarize your entire Devar Torah in basically a sentence. It may not give all the nuances, it may not be as, may not give every aspect of its power, but basically it'll say, my Devar Torah was about, Moses was more humble than anyone else because, or my whole message was, even though we suffer, God is with us. Even though I gave all kinds of details, and if a person can't do that, then on some level I haven't done a good job, because I should be able to walk away, because most people are going to forget whatever I said within 15 minutes, maybe less. So I'm trying to say, what can I do to help carry that message forward? It's a good question to ask yourself afterwards. All right. Last thing basically is delivery. And I know a lot of people here, you've done a lot of public speaking, so I'm probably telling you what you already know. But there are different ways to publicly speak. And, I've evolved over my time what works best for me. Jenny has a different model for her. Some people read the whole thing from prepared text and they practice it well and are able to engage through that and are frankly beautiful writers and beautiful speech writers and can do that well. That actually is not my strength, but I know I've seen people do that, and that is totally legitimate. Others use note cards, just take notes, which is more my style / memorizing, which means I did today, especially on the Yamim Nori and High Holy Days, some of you know, I practice mine forever. I put down I end up having 3 or 4 notes on a paper that basically say this idea, this, and then I try not even to look at it. Because my idea is I like being a live experience, but by the way, that's also my way of doing it. And Jenny, that's not her way. Everyone's fine. The point is, of course, every way is okay. The point simply is that it has to be a way that you're clear, you feel comfortable with, will not make you exceedingly nervous, and keeps the community engaged. You're just doing your best to try and engage that. And everyone has to do it in what style that works for them. I tell everyone, even though I don't always follow it myself, shorter is always better. People say to me, it's how long should it be? As short as you can possibly do it to make it meaningful. So if, and by the way, since I'm frustrated myself, I go too long, but the goal is to keep it tight. Generally tighter is better. And the last thing I say is, I learned this also from a very close friend of mine who's a journalist, is it's better to show people what you're talking, describe, tell, but don't say, instead of saying, this was really scary, describe a situation that people feel it being scary. That generally is a better way to keep people engaged, isn't it? So it's telling people how to feel, describe it. And hopefully if you're describing and your emotion and the way you're conveying yourself, people will feel something. Generally, but people feel something that keeps them engaged as well. Okay, you've gotten a summary of Rabbi Eric's tips. Anyone have any questions or thoughts? And absolutely, I'm going to share this with all of you.
I'll make a comment
Please.
About that reading from a prepared text.
Yeah.
In my experience, written English is different from oral English. Sentences are written longer. There's a lot of parenthetical, whatever. And if someone reads, whether it's the Devar Torah or a lecture at a science meeting, someone reads something that they wrote, which was well written, often it comes across very poorly because of the difference with the way we speak and the way we write, and there's a reason why they're different. So my suggestion is that reading exactly what you've written tends to come across not so well.
I would say I definitely look, there's no question, and this is a public speaking question really for anyone. I think you're making an excellent point. I want to say, for example, though, there's some, let's say our Holocaust speakers on Yom Kippur, our show, and I'm sure you agree with me. Many of them will say, Rabbi, I have to do this report. We have to. Of course you should. And it is, people are on every single word, right? So it's not, there is a way to, when the power of the writing or the style, I think you're right, meets that kind of colloquial, an ability to convey that can really grab people. So, I want to say that just the written piece, if done well, actually can be incredibly engaging. So really it's about knowing yourself and what your skill set is. But I think your point's well taken. Be careful not to write a beautiful novel. That's not going to be the same as speaking something. You said, Deborah, what do you say?
I always write mine and I read what I wrote, but
Yes.
I write it, I read it, I edit it, I write it, I read it, I edit it, and then I read it. So for me, the way that it's phrased is really important. And so, and I can't necessarily do that off the top of my head. Also, as anybody who knows me knows, I tend to, Rabbi Eric always says my presentation is very Talmudic. I think what he means by that is that I go off in like 500 different directions. If I don't write it down, I don't come back. I don't necessarily synthesize that and come back to where I started. So I have to write it down and I read what I wrote, although I do sometimes edit as I'm reading because I've made typos that I didn't catch. But for me, that's the style that works, working off note cards. I mean, I do that when I teach all the time. I just talk, but for something like a devar that or a speech of any kind, that doesn't work for me.
Yeah, totally kosher. Yeah, Alan, what do you say?
So I would agree with you and with Deborah. I tend to write like I speak. So, and when I'm reading things back, I'm saying them out loud. I talk to myself and people around me think I'm a little crazy, but that works for me. But I think the other part of it is not just knowing yourself, knowing your audience. And this is not an audience that we're unfamiliar with. This is an audience, we know people, we know some people less well than others, but it gives us a sense of how we position. And the one thing I would say, if you are reading, if someone, because we've all heard speakers read and they're not looking up from what they're reading. And if you don't look up and you don't engage with that audience, no matter what you have to say, your audience isn't looking at you either. So being able to, however it's presenting for me, it's how do I make myself live in doing that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Exactly. I think Alan's just raising a broader question in general, right? There's a tension or a power between what happens between the engagement between the speaker and the congregation, the community. Right? So you have to be aware of that dynamic. At the same time, you want to be able to feel comfortable with your confident about your presentation. So this is the tension between the two. But you fit, absolutely, totally. You have to look at your audience and know it well. So look, this was my shtick, which I'm going to share. Are there any questions that people want to ask either me or of the group in general about, like, you know, like if you've gone through this thing, some of you, this is old hat. Some of you are putting your toe in the water and thinking, hey, I'm thinking about giving a Dvar Torah. I know Eric and Jenny are pushing me to do it or asking. Does anyone have a particular question? What might help them move on that road towards giving a guest Dvar Torah? Is there something from this that has been helpful but still remains a question, or is there something that would be helpful to help make that next step, aside from obviously me and Jenny here to help? Is there some particular practice? Yeah, Roberta?
No, not necessarily, but one thing that you said about I should be able to summarize your Dvar Torah in a sentence really struck me for two reasons. First of all, I think that when people hear your Dvar Torahs, anybody's Dvar Torah, they really hear it, you know, so it might speak to one person and not another because of the situation that they're in, whatever it is. And I wonder who in this group can really remember anyone and say, I remember that one sentence. And I'm thinking of, in my lifetime, I've been to a lot of services, but there's two that I can really remember that so totally spoke to me. I don't know if this will make a difference or not, but one of them was in Ann Arbor with Rabbi Doberson. And I don't even remember the whole Devar, but what I remember from it is that human beings have the amazing ability to choose what to remember and what to forget. And that was really powerful. And the other one is Rabbi Solomon on a Rosh Hashanah. And I remember that the thing that stops you from doing is really what's going on between here, in here. I don't even remember that one. It's the one you wanted to beat your father at basketball.
Oh, yeah.
And you had the power in your belly and you had the desire and you practice and practice and practice. But what always stopped us, and it was really the Jewish people, what stops you is what's going on between here. So I really think that in and of itself can be very moving, very powerful and impactful.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, it's kind of cool in a way. It's very humbling as a rabbi when you realize like how many sermons we've given in Dvar Torah, and probably most carrying to remember two. But it's okay. It's okay. I can take it. It's okay. It's okay. I mean, it just shows it. Look, this is the challenge. Is how do you have something stick with people? This is a challenge for communication in general. But thank you, Roberta, for sharing that so far. Anyone have any questions or want any further tips, or this is a chance to kind of collectively share wisdom? All right. How about anyone here who's now after this class or before who has not given Devar Torah yet, maybe is more on that road towards it, I'm hoping? Anybody? Yeah, I'm looking around here. Okay, Robin, I like that. Alan, good. I'm hoping so. Because the goal here is definitely to encourage more people to have the opportunity to hear your voices too.
I might just mention February 26th would be a good day for that.
It would be awesome.
Debut.
We'd love to have someone for maybe a new person. And Linda's one of the people in charge of the ritual committee. We'd love to have you explore that if you're interested.
Linda, I think maybe you ought to do some arm twisting. You got the list of the participants.
Arm nudging.
Yes. Well, I'll let it settle here. And
What's
then,
the Parsha?
I mean, I need to get up there and do it again, but after that first one, I said, nope, I need training. But yeah, we do have a date coming up and plenty of time to prepare.
And I'm totally happy to help, me or Jenny. If you say, hey, I want to sign up for that one or a future one, and you say like, hey, but I want to walk through it, and not to mention you want to discuss them before, I'm sure we're going to help, to get it going. I mean, but with this stuff, it's nice material. I think everybody here has great.
Right.
All right, any last thoughts or questions about this? All right, you've gotten Beth Meyer's Mavens and Rabbi Eric's wisdom on creating, researching, delivering, inspiring Devar Torah. Again, if you have any questions, you should feel free to let me know. I will take everyone I see here, and I'll email this text to you guys so you can share with you. And that's it.